reappraisal of Wilhelm Wundt. Arthur L. Blumenthal, University of Massachusetts at Boston. Approximately 100 years ago, in an era of intellectual ferment, events of marked consequence took place in the history of psychology. It was in the decade of the 1870s that the first handbook of experimental psychology appeared, followed soon by the founding of the first formal laboratory of experimental psychology. Both were the achievements of Wilhelm Wundt, ever since recognized as experimental psychology's great patron, though later barred from any role that might remotely resemble sainthood. Soon after the wave of new psychologists spread out from Wundt's laboratory, a series of intellectual revolutions largely erased from memory the content of Wundtian psychological theory. Now that the movement set in motion by Wundt has come through its first century, it would seem fitting to mark the centenary by briefly turning back, re-examining psychology's historical foundations, and paying homage to the founding father. There is, however, another reason for review, being less ceremonial and clearly more interesting. To put it simply, the few current Wundt scholars, and some do exist, are in fair agreement that Wundt, as portrayed today in many texts and courses, is largely fictional and often bears little resemblance to the actual historical figure. C.F. Blumenthal, 1970, Bringman, Balance, and Evans, 1975, Mischel, 1970. Naturally, it might be suspected that the above radical statement is only the nitpicking of a few antiquarians obsessed with minor matters of interpretation. But alas, such is not the case. These are claims about the very fundamentals of Wundt's work, often asserting the opposite of what has been a standard description prevailing over much of the past century. Yet, if popular historical accounts. This article is a revised and expanded version of a talk presented to the New York Academy of Sciences, New York City, October 19, 1974. Requests for reprints should be sent to Arthur L. Blumenthal, 48, Kirkland Street, Cambridge, Massachusetts, 02138. If Wundt are in need of serious correction, then one might again ask whether Wundt still turns out to be irrelevant and of little interest. This article is addressed to that question, and its answers will, I suspect, contain some surprises for many readers. There is another question that immediately follows upon these claims. It is, how could such historical misinterpretations have arisen? This is surely a fascinating question, but one requiring separate treatment. For the moment, merely take note that Wundtian anecdotes have long been passed down from author to author without worthy recourse to original sources, and, also, that it is common in intellectual history for later schools of thought to foster distortions and misinterpretations of earlier ones, psychology, of course, offering numerous opportunities. For now, let us examine the fundamentals of Wundt's psychology that have, for better or worse, been disguised or lost in the course of history's machinations. Wundt's method. The basic premise in Wundtian psychology is that the only certain reality is immediate experience. Proceeding from this premise, Wundt had accepted the following goals for all science: the construction of explanations of experience and the development of techniques for objectifying experience. By the latter, he meant that the scientist attempts to communicate and reproduce his experiences in others in standardized ways. Thus it becomes possible to perform tests that lead to public agreement about phenomena and to agreement about their explanation. This was commonplace for Wundt and is found at the outset of many of his texts. In the natural sciences, as Wundt continues, it is the attributes of experience derived from external objects and energies that are subjected to tests, explanations, and public agreement. But in the case of psychology, it is the attributes of experience derived from the processes of the experiencing subject that are made the object of tests, explanations, and public agreement. These. American Psychologist, November 197 S. 1081. Psychological entities include experienced memory and perceptual capacities, fluctuations of attention or alertness, ranges of our sensitivities, etc. In the jargon of today, we would without hesitation say human information processing capacities. Yet it is this subtle division between the physical and the psychological sciences that has led to innumerable textbook treatments of Wundt as a mind-body dualist, and that is one of history's glaring distortions. For if you read Wundt, in almost any of his texts, you will discover that his rejection of mind-body dualism is as emphatic a statement on the matter as you are likely ever to encounter. He often said that psychology cannot be denied as the science of the mind because there are no objects called minds that are distinct from objects called bodies, a scenario that appears repeatedly in his works. Although physiologists and psychologists study one and the same organism, Wundt viewed them as analyzing and objectifying different experiences, derived from different vantage points. This is now usually called the double-aspect resolution of the mind-body problem. And Wundt's use of the phrase psychophysical parallelism referred to this same view, though again it unfortunately led many later reviewers to the mind-body dualism interpretation. Rather, it referred to the separate orientations of physiology and psychology where it is separate methodologies, in the sense of separate types of observations, that here run in parallel. Another serious problem of misinterpretation concerns Wundt and introspection. Contrary to frequent descriptions, Wundt was not an introspectionist as that term is popularly applied today. The thrust behind his entire experimental program was the claim that progress in psychology had been slow because of reliance on casual, unsystematic introspection, which had led invariably to unresolvable debates. In several books and monographs, in particular, 1888 and 1907, Wundt argued that armchair introspection could, in principle, never succeed, being a logical impossibility as a scientific technique. The 1907 monograph was a severe critique of the Wiersburg psychologists for their return to an earlier style of unverifiable introspection. Wundt promoted the cause of experimental psychology more through accomplishments in his laboratory than through polemics. From its outset, the Wundtian program followed the general conceptions of experimental science and the requirement that private experience be made public and replicable, in this case for the study of perception, attention, memory, etc. To be sure, there were some disagreements, conflicting data, and unsupported speculations in those days, just as there are today. Wundt's adherence to the canons of experimental procedure was so strict that, in fact, it sharply limited his use of experiments in psychology. Thus, in the case of most higher mental processes such as language or concept formation, he felt that true experiments were not feasible. Instead, these topics must, he argued, be studied through techniques of historical and naturalistic observation and also of logical analysis. This Wundt did by examining the social-cultural products of human mental activity, making logical inferences about the underlying processes. In the case of language, for example, he went deeply into the technical study of linguistics, Blumenthal, 1970. So in these ways, a large part of Wundt's psychological work is not experimental. Wundt's theoretical system. But so far these are methodological matters and do not speak to the essence of Wundt's psychological theory. What emerged as the paradigm psychological phenomenon in his theoretical system would now be described as selective volitional attention. It is why he identified his psychology as voluntaristic to distinguish it from other schools, see especially Wundt, 1896b. He did not use the label structuralist, which was proffered and perpetuated by Titchener and James. Michel, 1970, has recently surveyed Wundt's writings, detailing Wundt's grounding in volitional motivational processes. Yet it was with apparent forceful impact on later historical interpretation that Titchener, 1908, had given short shrift to this theme, at the very heart of Wundtian psychology, because of the overtones of continental idealist philosophy in notions of volition. Titchener's longest period of formal education came at Oxford, and not surprisingly, he maintained certain biases toward the British empiricist sensationist tradition, even though that tradition was anathema to Wundt's views, and more than any other topic the brunt of Wundt's polemical writings. Without giving supportive citation, Boring, 1950, states that Wundt had opposed the implicatien of an active volitional agent in psychology. But now Michel, 1970, with extensive citation, has shown, on the contrary, that volition motivation. 1082 November 1975 American Psychologist is a central, primary theme in Wundt's psychology. Briefly, that theme runs as follows. To explain a volitional act on the basis of its motives is different from the explanation of occurrences in the physical sciences, and volitional activities are the type in terms of which all other psychological phenomena are to be construed. Wundt, 1908, Volume 3, page 162. Wundt's studies of volition, in turn, amounted to an elaborate analysis of selective and constructive attentional processes, often summarized under the term apperception, which he localized in the brain's frontal lobes. Other psychological processes, perceptions, thoughts, memories, are, according to Wundt, generally under the control of the central attentional process. It is on this basis that Wundt claimed another point of separation between psychology and phys-ICS, a difference between psychological and physical causality, see especially Wundt, 1894. In the case of physics, actions and events obey inviolable laws, but in the case of psychosocial phenomena, actions are made by an active agent with reference to rule systems. Wundt acknowledged the principle of the conservation of energy and, consequently, the theoretical possibility of reducing psychological observations to physiological or physical descriptions. Still, he argued, these physical sciences would then describe the act of greeting a friend, eating an apple, or writing a poem in terms of the laws of mechanics or in terms of physiology. And no matter how fine-grained and complicated we make such descriptions, they are not useful as descriptions of psychological events. Those events need be described in terms of intentions and goals, AC according to Wundt, because the actions, or physical forces, for a given psychological event may take an infinite variety of physical forms. In one notable example, he argued that human language cannot be described adequately in terms of its physical shape or of the segmentation of utterances, but rather must be described as well in terms of the rules and Intentions underlying speech. For the ways of expressing a thought in language are infinitely variable, and language is governed by creative rules rather than fixed laws. Wundt, 1900 to 1920. Mechanism or organism. These distinctions lead to a related and consistent theme in Wundt's writings concerning what he called the false materialization of mental processes, which he found prevalent in other schools of psychology, especially associationism. His weak tie-ins against associationism were directed mostly at the form it had assumed in mid-19th century Germany in Herbart's psychology. Herbart, you may recall, had atomized mental processes into elemental ideas that became associated into compounds according to classical associationist descriptions. Wundt considered the AP approach to be a mere primitive analogy to systems of physical mechanics, and he argued at length that those systems teach little about the interrelations of psychological processes. Wundt, 1894. For those systems were oblivious to what he felt was the essential distinction between psychological and physical causality. They portrayed mental processes as if they were a mere field of billiard balls colliding and interacting with each other, where central control processes are lacking. Boring's widely repeated assertion that Wundt turned to chemistry for his model seems clearly inaccurate to the serious reader of Wundt. However, the Wundtian mental chemistry cliché did become popular among later textbook writers. Wundt did in his early years make brief, passing references to J.S. Mill's use of a chemical analogy to describe certain perceptual processes, namely, that one cannot determine the quality of water, i.e., wetness, from the separate qualities of oxygen and hydrogen. Similarly, the qualities of a perception are not directly given in its underlying elements. But Wundt points out that this analogy does not go far enough, and by the end of the century he is describing it as a false analogy because the chemical synthesis is, in the final analysis, wholly determined by its elements, while the psychological synthesis is truly a new formation, not merely the result of a chemical-like formation. And J.S. Mill's discussion, in which the mental forma tie-in is conceived as a psychic chemistry, leaves out its most significant aspect, the special creative character of psychic syntheses. Wundt, 1902, p. 684. What the chemical analogy lacks is the independent, constructive, attentional process, which in the psychological case is the source of the synthesis. Wundt did, of course, write chapters on elementary sensory perceptual processes and elemental affective processes, but with the emphasis on process. And he acknowledged that a major part of any scientific methodology involved analysis of a system into component processes. Further, he stressed that these elements were to be taken as American Psychologist, November 1975, 1083. Hypothetical